So the Victorian age, named after Queen Victoria, who was queen from 1837 to 1901. Okay, what about it? Under Queen Victoria, in the Victorian age, of course, we see the largest extension of the empire, the British Empire, encompassing approximately a quarter of the world's landmass and a quarter of its population. It depends on how you count. Okay, and here you see a picture, here you see a map of the world, and all the red, of course, countries under British rule, and this is very extensive. And if you then consider that, of course, the United States of America speak English too, okay, and most of the Caribbean and so on, and you can see that English influence and the influence of the English language, of course, as we know it, is immense. Of course it is. You know? And don't forget, I mean, that the English had, or the British had, two empires. The first one in the West, okay, encompassing the United States and most of the Caribbean, which they lost, okay. Then they built a second one, and predominantly under Queen Victoria, particularly, of course, India and Africa. Okay. The Victorian age is also an age of transition, and people were aware of the fact that they live in an age where a lot of things change. And the predominant thing is, of course, that agricultural society is, of course, supplanted by an industrial society. So we see industrialization in the 19th century, in the Victorian age predominantly. And this industrialization, of course, led to an urbanization. And this was the time when, I mean, big cities in England exploded, particularly those cities in the north, okay, Manchester, Liverpool, I don't know, Derby, Stoke-on-Trent, and others, because this was where the industry was. But we come to that. Yeah, an age of transition insofar as the old way of life in the country is, of course, completely changed to an urban society, industrial society, age of transition. Okay, and we call all this the Industrial Revolution. Okay, and the main industries were, I mean, these are just some of them, but these are the main industries in England in the age of industrialization. Textiles predominantly, okay, so cotton industry, wool and so on. Chemicals, dyes and other things which you need. Steel, very important, of course, for the British fleet. Steel and for constructing industrial plants, machines and so on. So steel industry is, of course, big. And mining, yes, I mean, you need a lot of energy for an industrial revolution, particularly for the production of steel. Okay, yes, you do. And this is, by the way, one reason why most of the industry is up north in those days, in Manchester and Liverpool and probably further on Glasgow and what have you, because this is where the coal was. The same with the Ruhr area in Germany. I mean, you build steel industry there where the energy is, because you don't want to ship the coal half around the country. Just build it there and use the coal where you get it from. I mean, the same is true for the Ruhr, and the same is true for Britain, okay, particularly for the north of Britain, because this is where the industry was. This would be an image of a city in the 19th century. And you see, it's probably very pleasant to live there. Of course it is not. And here, yes, of course, child labor still very much the rule in those days. Okay, but we have to consider factors that contributed to the Industrial Revolution and why in England and so on. So the question is, why the Industrial Revolution in England in the 19th century? Yeah? Why did they invent industrialization? I mean, the Germans took over later on, but yeah, I mean, they were the ones to invent it. I mean, colonies, of course, is a very important factor because for industrialization, you need raw materials. So where do you get the raw materials from? Particularly sugarcane, okay, cotton, and different ores and so on. Okay, you import them from the colonies. So it's a big advantage to have a lot of colonies, of course. And then you can, the products you produce, I mean, you can sell it back to the colonies. Okay? Oh, yes. So it's a much bigger market than any other European country had in those days. So yes, colonies play a very important role. So did science. Britain had a very advanced system of science insofar as most of the scientists were organized in the Royal Society. So there is a lot of exchange of new scientific method and of applied sciences and so on. Okay, and this is a big advantage if you compare it to other European countries who didn't have that, a system, yeah, where science, new scientific ideas are exchanged, a market for scientific ideas, if you like. Also science, very advanced in England, and this is what you need for an industrialization, science, of course. Coal, we talked about that. There was a lot of coal, and you need coal for industrialization, particularly up north. A lot of coal is there, a lot of mining and so on. So coal, yes, plays a very important role. Okay, infrastructure. Yes, for industrialization, you have to transport things across the country. First of all, Britain is united. Okay, it is stable, another very important factor. It's politically stable, not like Germany, I mean, where you have borders, small states, and you have to cross a border every time. No, you can go right across the country if you like. This is a big advantage, of course. But England also has a lot of canals. Okay, still up to the present day, so you can actually use canals, draw boats across the country. You have that. And then Britain, being an island, so you can ship actually things around the island on sea. Yeah. For example, you produce something in Liverpool which you want to sell in London. I mean, you just ship it and go once around the country and arrive at the Thames and disembark there. Okay, so infrastructure is good, and they had the railways. A big railway system, the first country in Europe which had a very extensive railway system. Okay, right. Oh, so this contributed to the Industrial Revolution. Protestantism, of course, did. Yeah, Protestantism, insofar, and we talked about that. You remember when we talked about the Reformation, that there is something like a Protestant work ethic. So the Protestant works more than the Catholic does, usually, because, I mean, the Protestant wants to have a sign that he is the chosen one. He wants to have success in life, a Protestant, much more than a Catholic, because success is an indicator that you will go up to heaven. So you want to have success in life, you work, and even more so if you earn money building industry from your industry, and if you're an entrepreneur, whatever you would call them, you reinvest. You don't spend your money. I mean, once you made a lot of money in industry, you build a new factory, and then you build another factory, and so on. And this is how Protestantism works. Yes, certainly no coincidence that the Industrial Revolution started in what was in those days probably the most Protestant country in Europe. Another thing is enclosure. Yes, enclosure, which contributed to urbanization. You have to see one thing. Enclosure means that common lands around the villages, common land was enclosed. You had in the olden days, you had probably something like 40% of the land around a village in the country was accessible to everybody. So poor people could go there, raise their own crops, have their own cattle, whatever. Now this land was sold out to rich landowners in the 19th century, starting in the 18th century already, which means that those poor people didn't have anywhere to go anymore if they wanted to, yes, plant their own wheat, barley, what have you. So basically they couldn't subsist anymore. And what they did, they fled to the cities, okay? And then in the cities, you have a big influx from people from the country who need work. So what do? You exploit them, okay? This would be a very Marxist way of looking at it. But yes, I mean, there was a lot of labor, and this is what you need for an industrialization. You need basically three things. You need land, okay? You need capital, and you also need labor, okay? And there was a lot of labor. In addition to that, so enclosure, yeah, the taking away of the common land contributed to that, and of course Irish immigration too, because Ireland in 1801 became part of Great Britain, if you like. So a lot of poor people from Ireland migrated to the big cities in the north, particularly Liverpool and Manchester, so that by today you certainly have something like, I think 1/3 of the population of Liverpool is of Irish stock. Okay, of course. Okay, yeah, all that. One more thing I would like to say. This is utilitarianism. Okay, if you have an industrialization, and what is the biggest principle? I mean, you want to satisfy the masses, okay? And that's the thing. Industrialization also led to a concept called utilitarianism, which we still have up to the present day to some extent, which basically means that everything you do is considered whether it has the greatest benefit for the greatest number of people. Okay, basically you want to satisfy the masses. And this utilitarianism is applied to everything, to literature and to the arts as well. So why produce art anymore, which is very elitist, as in Romanticism, or even more so in the 18th century? Why produce art which is only for a very small fraction, novels, or poetry, for a very small fraction of society? You want to satisfy the masses. This brought an end to Romanticism in a way, because Romanticism is not for the masses. I mean, it's some poet talking about his own feelings, but why should everybody be concerned in Wordsworth's feelings? Not at all. Okay, so yes, there is a big crisis in literature. And of course, this is the first time when the novel took over as the main literary genre, because if you want to satisfy the masses, utilitarianism, you produce novels, okay? Novels which can be read by everybody, much more than elitist poetry. And this is what we will see later on. I mean, what poets in Victorian times, poets, I'm talking about poets, not novelists, what they struggled is, how can you still write poetry in the age of utilitarianism? Is there a kind of poetic writing of poetry which, in a way, benefits a great number of people? Very difficult, okay? And so, yes, poetry is in a big crisis. This does not mean that you don't have some of the greatest poets, but yes, yeah, the novel becomes the main genre, because the novel is the equivalent in those days of private television, of course. Yeah. We will talk about literature in detail. Okay.